Imagine if you combined Harry Potter and the Chronicles of Narnia and geared it towards adults. That is exactly a description that you would commonly hear if people were to describe the magicians. For the sake of convenience, this does sound like an apt description, but it is a rather shallow summary of this particular show. The Magicians certainly has the elements of a magical education institution and a whole whimsical world for the protagonists to discover and rule, but it was always much more than that. And you might wonder, if it is really more than that, why is it not more popular? Why is it not more mainstream? The show was on air from 2015 till 2020, and it has faded into obscurity ever since. Why is that? Well, firstly, it is rather a modest fantasy show. It doesn't have an HBO-level budget, star power, or effects. Secondly, it is not exactly a show that has the broadest possible appeal. It certainly isn't for everyone. For better or for worse, it is bold in its ideas and its presentation. It offers a different view on fantasy as you know it. This is where any comparisons to Harry Potter and the Chronicles of Narnia fall short. It has common elements with these stories, but The Magicians is a complete antithesis to what is presented in these narratives. It tries to challenge the common archetypes and tropes usually present in fantasy works. Take for instance the very first episode of The Magicians titled Unauthorized Magic. It shows us Quentin and Julia, two of the main characters, being transported to the magical world. Just as some other magical worlds out there, it is hidden, and is seen by both characters as a wander to which they stumble upon in rather magical, whimsical ways. We see the pair take an entrance exam, and the fates of these two characters are then contrasted. Quentin gets through into Breakbills, the university for magicians, yet the show dares to ask, what happens if you do not get in? What happens when the magical world rejects you instead of accepting you? We see Julia be dangled the idea of a magical world existing right in front of her face, yet ultimately not passing the entrance exam. With any memory of this world being erased from her mind, she finds a way to cling on these memories and to regain the knowledge she was stripped of, and she yearns to find a way to be part of this magical world. And who wouldn't? It is a very human reaction of knowing that something more exists yet being denied of it. We also see Quentin be welcomed into this world. We see him walking through the campus of Breakbills, being shown how upon first sight, wonderful the world of magic can appear. Yet the first episode is rather quick to show that not everything is as whimsy. It does appear to have the usual crook in there that any other magical world would have. Julia, on the other hand, is still left to grapple with the fact that the magical world has rejected her, yet she still finds an in, not through a fancy university with a large campus, but through a seemingly abandoned warehouse, signaling that this magical world has a gritty, sketchy underbelly. In this way, the show sends both characters down very different paths. The pilot episode displays Quentin finally dabbling into the magic that he has newly discovered to be real, along with his fellow students and other main characters of the show, Alice, Penny, and Katie. They get together to try and contact Alice's deceased brother. The spell seemingly doesn't work, or does it? The show then offers us an unnerving hook, a promise. But as we find out later on, it is far a promise of wonder. The spell indeed has worked, and we see just how efficiently it has. We see Quentin take one of the first magical classes on the show, and then suddenly, it all goes wrong. As the main villain of this arc steps out of the mirror, aptly titled The Beast, you realize that the magic the students had cast have very grim consequences. And the Beast, you would think, is this story's Voldemort, but no, his presentation is much, much worse. And all of this is exactly the axis upon which rests the entire show. Kas yra fantastika? Ar langas, ar dordgäver? Ja, trots att jag också ska så vitt att jag såg skärp. To fully understand the show, we must first take a look at the bedrock that it is built upon. The Magicians is a rather sobering look at magic, an extreme opposite on the spectrum of what you would expect from a fantasy show with magic. Magic, at least at first, is usually associated with wonder, with it making one's life better and adventurous. The show's philosophy instead chooses to view it as a vice rather than a virtue, a problem rather than a solution. In this show, magic itself is almost like a character on its own, as it drives some of the characters' motivations, influences events and plots, and it corrupts way more than it fixes. The Magician ponders what happens if magic is not a place to escape into, but rather to escape from. This sort of mentality permeates all facets of how the show approaches magic. First and foremost, no one here waves around any magic wands or utters simple phrases to achieve their objectives. Here, the magic practitioners are shown as being required to put in actual work. Not that the other fantasies do not include trials and tribulations in regards to magic and its use. The Magicians, however, aptly for its setting of a university, approaches magic from a highly academic angle. What I particularly like about it is how it feels academic. Magic here has disciplines. It has complex spells that require precision. Even the spells themselves have specific names that suggest they weren't exactly produced by some wizard in a cave. In a way, this sort of approach removes much of the wonder that may be conventionally attached to the notion of magic. Makes it feel like any other academic field that would at first seem interesting, but then turn out to be rather tedious and boring to learn. But magic is a tool, a means. But a means to what end? The Magicians ponders this as well. This question is in part answered by a particular storyline within the show. In Season 1, Episode 5, titled Mendings, Major and Minor, one of the main characters, Quentin Coldwater, receives news that his father is rather unwell.
My dad's sick.
As Quentin finds out, the nature of his father's affliction is rather a serious one.
It's brain cancer.
The logical and natural reaction from Quentin is to try and to fix the situation. After all, he has magic now. He has found out that a magical secret world exists. The episode displays Quentin as trying to find a magical solution to his father's predicament. He consults with people who are more knowledgeable in the matters of magic, yet he does not exactly receive an answer that he was looking for.
If magicians could cure cancer, why would anybody have cancer? Fair warning, what you're looking for might be impossible.
Eventually, after failed attempts by Quentin to find a solution, the episode lands on this conclusion.
What is the point of any of this of magic if we can't fix real problems?
We can fix some things. So we fix what we can.
The common underlying principle within this magic system is that there are serious limitations and repercussions to what a magician can or cannot do. The show invites you into the magical world, yes, but so what? Magic doesn't fix what actually matters. When the show does show its characters use magic to actually solve real problems, it never comes without a serious cost attached. In the 3rd episode of the 2nd season, Alice does defeat the beast, but she herself then becomes another being entirely. At the end of Season 3, Julia recreates the magic key that should restore all magic, yet she loses her own magic in the process. At the end of Season 4, Quentin manages to use magic and vanquish the monster, an antagonist of that season, yet he loses his life. The show consistently shows that for the most part, magic is only capable of fixing problems that are themselves caused by magic, and even then this doesn't apply to all cases. In a way, magic comes and corrupts. It creates cycles of destruction, but the relationship between magic and its users is interesting. As we have already established, the show regards magic as a vice. It is displayed more so as a corrupting force, but it is also an addictive one. Magic doesn't really fix anything, as the show acknowledges, yet we still see characters seek it out. Multiple times characters are negatively affected by its existence in one way or another, yet none of them really steer clear. The motivation to remain part of the magical world, of course, at times go deeper than simply leaving because it causes inconvenience. But this is the fuel behind the 3rd season of the show. The ending of the 2nd season leaves the world without magic, turning it into a scarce resource not as easily accessible as before. Yet we still see people seek it out in at times extreme ways. The season itself does pose questions as to whether magic even should be brought back, but at the end the characters still go through with it and manage to turn it back on. I believe this approach to magic speaks to human nature. Once you get a taste of something, you cannot simply turn away. This characterization of magic is rather fitting with what the show chooses as its origins for magic itself.
Funny little irony they don't tell you. Magic doesn't come from talent. It comes from pain.
There's a sense of cohesion between its origins and its effects, both usually being of destructive nature, but magic, as Dean Fogg points out, is capable of fixing some things. There are moments where magic is displayed as having a positive effect. In Season 4, Alice, with the help of magic, is capable of aiding an entire community. Throughout Season 3, Julia uses her powers to help people. There are moments when it is not always bad. There is some good within the generally bleak picture of this magical world that the Magicians paints. It is a grounded approach to magic, but it still leaves plenty of room for more whimsical elements of fantasy. The Magicians doesn't only limit itself to the inclusion of magic. In this universe there exists entire different worlds, along with their dangers. The most prominent other world is Fillory, a twisted analog to Narnia. Just like with magic, the show chooses to corrupt this concept. One of the main characters, Quentin, is shown as being a fan of the book series titled Fillory and Further. This is a clear analog to the Chronicles of Narnia that exists within the real world, but unlike the real world counterpart, the world of Fillory actually turns out to be real. Quentin, a fan of the series, enters this world with certain expectations, but his entrance soon becomes sullied.
Welcome to Fillory 2016.
It's just a lot colder. It's like being in a fog that never lifts.
Here, the Aslan counterparts, Ember and Umber, are not as noble or heroic. One of the two gods is missing, while the other is hiding away while the magical world is being corrupted by the beast. Ember is shown as selfish and arrogant, not really interested in helping the protagonists out of the kindness of his heart. This world is also destined to be ruled by the children of Earth. Our protagonists receive a crowning ceremony, yet as soon as they actually occupy their thrones, we find out that the thrones carry a curse. Even when the curse is broken and the characters finally assume their roles as rulers, they find out that Fillory is itself full of issues and problems to be solved, and isn't a wonderland that the fantasy books might have promised. The Magicians include many more gods, yet they are consistently displayed as selfish, self-serving, and entitled, a far cry from oftentimes idealized images of divinity. This world also includes various creatures, vampires, werewolves, fairies, yet none of them are whimsical in their presentation on the show. This is exactly the world of magic that the Magicians chooses to craft. For better or for worse, it chooses to corrupt various concepts and tropes that commonly reoccur in the genre of fantasy. It darkens the colors instead of saturating them. It takes a bold approach and presents a darker reality. It doesn't treat these ideas with the same rose-tinted glasses some other works of fantasy would. It is certainly a unique synthesis of concepts and ideas, as well as their presentation. But what we have discussed now is just world building, a bedrock. World building exists to reflect and facilitate what a particular piece is attempting to convey. Thus, it is now the time to take a look at what sort of stories the Magicians chooses to tell in the world that it builds. The Magicians, being a fantasy show, has an interesting challenge on its hands. In a world which contains gods, various creatures, and beings, it has to present a story that appropriately scales and escalates as it progresses, and it is certainly a challenge to muster enough creativity to carry a 5-season fantasy show whilst keeping it fresh and engaging, as well as in keeping with the overall thematic choices and maintaining consistency. The question is, how does the Magicians manage to pull off this job? Purely on entertainment grounds, Season 1 is not the best season of the show, and I mean that in the best possible sense. What it does is introduce us to this world, and I think it does so rather interestingly. It conveys the core principles of magic as well as builds out characters that are reflective of the world they find themselves in. On a narrative level, it operates in two primary halves, two major storylines. The seeds of it are first planted in the first conversation that the two characters and childhood friends, Quentin and Julia, share.
Come on, what if...
No, you have to stop!
Stop what?
You can't run away hard enough, can you? What happened to giving up on the Fillory crowd?
These two halves then both begin from the entrance exam into the magical university of Breakbills, and branch out through a single difference in the exam's outcome. Quentin, who was still mentally stuck in a world of fantasy, gets in, while Julia, who is seen as having moved on from the seemingly childish notions of fantasy, does not. This provides effective catalyst for the two halves of the plot for the first season. What ensues at first is quite basic territory. The two characters serve as audience surrogates as they get initiated into their respective parts of the magical world. We get to meet the casts of characters as Quentin and Julia proceed to blend into their respective corners. But we also get to encounter the Beast, this looming threat that we get ominous clues about. The identity of this villain is yet unknown, a mystery to be unraveled. For roughly the first half of the season, we do not yet get deep into the Beast. The show takes its time to build out the relationships between the characters, set up its world, and starts off simple enough. This is not exactly something groundbreaking, and it may seem boring, but I actually like the way the season simply takes its time. We get to see characters learning magic, actually getting educated or dealing with their own struggles. We did not jump into something too complicated just yet. This again might seem boring, but the show does this to allow both the viewer and the characters to get used to all the quirks of this new magical world and build up its characters. It is around episode 8, roughly the midway point of the season titled The Strangled Heart, that the show begins to shift its gears. The fun and games are over, and the show takes on a far more serious edge. After being cast out once again,
No.
only this time from a group called Hedge Witches, Julia ends up in a facility where she meets a person named Richard. The two of them talk about magic.
Look, you think magic is some terrible vice. It's not. Magic isn't heroin, Julia. It's a gift. Okay, what we call magic is a set of tools left over from creation. Gods, they don't do things by accident. Tools were left for us to find.
Afterwards, we get to see Julia pray to the divine powers and actually get an answer. On the other side of the show, we get to see one of the guiding characters, Jane Chatwin, be killed by the Beast. The episode concludes on a very dire note.
Eliza is dead. She's the only one who could actually give me answers.
There are no answers, Quentin. We have no idea what's going to happen. Most likely outcome, we all die.
In a way, from this point onwards, the show switches the positions that Julia and Quentin find themselves in. Up until this point, we saw Julia be casted out of the magical world again and again, and now it would seem like she was heading on a trajectory that would lead to something greater. Perhaps now she found a corner of this magic world to which she can fit, to which she can belong. And up until this point, we saw Quentin be accepted by the magical world, and he, whilst encountering problems from time to time, got to experience it with relative ease. Yet now he was facing a real danger in the form of the beast that could prove lethal. Of course, this can be seen as a simplification, but it does provide for an interesting plot progression moving forward. It is in the next episode, titled The Writing Room, that we begin getting real investigation into who the beast might be. Now, the interesting thing that The Magicians does is having Quentin be a fan of the book series Fillory and Further. You see, since the show reveals that the first presumed fictional world of Fillory is actually real, the once thought fictional books of Fillory and Further are not made up, but rather based on fragments of truth. And while up until that point the show flirted with the idea that Fillory might still be a world of whimsy and fantasy, it is this episode that strips away the last remnants of that illusion, as Quentin finds out the dark truth behind the books, as well as the author. It is within this episode that Quentin and his friends realize that the author himself, and also the childhood idol of Quentin, might actually be the Beast.
What if the beast wasn't from Fillory? What if he went there because he had access via these kids who he liked to tell stories to?
From this point forward, the beast begins asserting himself in more threatening ways. We see Quentin and his friends preparing for the upcoming fight, getting stronger, learning battle magic, and episode 12 is where we see the characters planning to begin enacting their plan to defeat the beast. They teleport to a place between worlds called the Netherlands, a place full of fountains that act as entryways into different realms, planning on jumping into a fountain that takes them to Fillory. But the show makes their plan fail right from the beginning. It separates Quentin from his friends. His friends do end up in Fillory without him, yet Quentin still needs to find his way there. This leads him to a character called Dean Fogg. It is here that Quentin finally gets to learn the truth.
Okay, what does Jane have to do with the beast?
Ember gave her the ability to fuck with time on a cosmic scale, and Jane used it to create a time loop. She failed to stop the beast. She'd restart the loop,
which ultimately leads him back to a familiar face.
Hi.
It is from episode 9 that we see Julia go through a path towards finding a new magic community, as well as towards learning more magic itself. We see her level up and eventually be placed on track towards something bigger, getting in contact with a deity. The objectives of her side of the narrative consist of not fighting some sort of a villain, but rather to find solutions to problems that some of Julia's friends have. These solutions cannot be provided by regular means of magic, so naturally they seek out powers that are bigger than themselves. The divine angle that the show chooses to take, I think, is quite interesting. It expands the show's mythology and takes it in an interesting direction. We see Julia along with her friends progress up the ladder until we encounter her again in episode 12, when Quentin comes seeking her help.
Hi.
It is here that she receives an explanation as to why she was not allowed into Breakbills.
Jane thought, cast you out in the cold and you would get stronger.
At this point, the show positions her being shunned out as something that was necessary in order to be prepared for whatever calamity was closing in. I believe that their conversation here quite interestingly runs in contrast with the first conversation between Julia and Quentin in the show.
There is bigger, better magic in the world.
And you would not believe some of the shit I've seen.
What?
I can't sit here now and think it was anything but fate.
Right, or just the right random combination.
Okay, suit yourself, nihilist.
Throughout the narrative of the season, the two of them ended up on opposite ends. It is now Julia who believes in magic, in bigger, better magic in fact, that is capable of fixing. It is her that now believes in fantasy, while Quentin, throughout the season, was consistently shown how his perception of magic and the fantasy he had created inside his head was essentially a lie. The use of a deity and somewhat religious motif for Julia to regain her belief in magic is also interesting and apt, yet it is only fitting that the narrative finds a way to reunite the two of them. In a way, Julia having sought out this higher power just might have at least part of the answer as to how to defeat a powerful being such as the Beast. And it is also fitting for the two of them, childhood friends who both used to be fans of the same fantasy book series, to be able to both be a part of this magical world and have their own adventure. The two of them find their way into Fillory, into the magical world that they once found themselves believing to be full of fantasy. After the defeat of the Beast, the story then progresses in an interesting and also organic way. The primary storylines are essentially constructed around the fallout of the Beast storyline. Quentin is on track to deal with the death of Alice, who passed away during the confrontation with the Beast. Elliot and Margo are left to rule Fillory. Julia is left to deal with the aftermath of her encounter with the evil god Reynard the Fox, along with Katie, a person she met during her pursuits of magic, as well as the girlfriend of Penny. This results in a couple of things. The show moving away towards Fillory now is a logical escalation, considering they spent the last season setting it up. The positioning of Elliot and Margo as the rulers of Fillory introduces some fresh storylines, such as the problems within Fillory and some politics. Now, the politics that they do introduce are never on an actually serious or fleshed out level. The Magicians doesn't make a point to become the next Game of Thrones, in keeping with its overall theme of viewing the supposedly magical world more so as a joke than anything else.
I present Princess of Loria.
I'm sorry. Princess?
But again, this sort of escalation and progression does make sense. In regards to the general picture of the season, the narrative, in comparison to Season 1, is simply not as cohesive. The characters, in a way, are running in different directions. What unified Season 1 was the common threat of the Beast. Of course, Julia's storyline was rather separate, but everything did come to a single narrative, with all storylines having built up to a specific conclusion. The same cannot exactly be said about Season 2. Season 2 attempts to set up a villain, Ember, a literal god as the villain would, once again, be an interesting progression from the Beast. This god of Fillory commits acts of mischief to cause drama and, according to him, make Fillory entertaining to watch. He tampers with the wellspring, which in theory should provide an interesting complication for the characters, which connects them in a way, but this gets resolved rather quickly. Other than that, the villain's mischief rarely extends to any other characters besides Margo and Elliot. What also sets the Fillory storyline apart is that it doesn't really have a clear endgame. While Alice and Quentin, Julia and Katie, as well as Penny do have some sort of an endgame that they are searching for, Elliot and Margo are simply trying to rule the kingdom. This is not necessarily a bad idea by any means, but it doesn't really provide as much incentive to watch as the other storylines narrative-wise. But it is entertaining, I will give it that. The season does culminate with Ember being the main force that the characters have to deal with, which results in most of them having to come together, but mostly due to the fact that they are main characters and they are friends, and not necessarily because the narrative demands it. What I mean by that is that the smaller individual storylines do not really feed into the final fight, and they do not necessarily have to. Yet I do think that there were rather obvious ways in which they could have. You would think that, for example, the storyline of Julia would come into play at least in some way. Her storyline focused on dealing with the god who assaulted her. We saw her go through a lot of trouble in order to figure out how to deal with Reynard, and she had gathered a lot of knowledge on the matter. We also see her even prepare a weapon to kill a god, a weapon that she could have used on Ember, but that weapon was nowhere to be seen during the final fight. That is because Persephone took it away from her for some reason, but I sure think it would have been a good thing for the characters to have. Other storylines also have rather weak connections to this fight. Penny in the library has very little to do with anything at all. Quentin reviving Alice also didn't really do anything. Are they nice storylines on their own? They are good enough, certainly, but the main narrative force that makes most of the characters come together to fight the final boss of the season was simply that they had to save magic from Ember destroying it, which renders a lot of storylines as simply irrelevant. Again, not exactly something that is entirely bad. On its own, the narrative of the season is fragmented and disjointed, the most disjointed in the history of the show. While they do at times try to connect characters and storylines. It still doesn't feel as coherent, but when you take a step back and look at it as part of one whole, it is clear that the season was setting up something much bigger and, in my opinion, much better. We first hear of this something through the character of Sylvia that Penny encounters in the library.
The Order's known about it for years. They call it the Great Blank Spot, some kind of cataclysmic badness.
Well, what causes it?
They don't know, just that it happens soon, like weeks.
The show dropped these little hints here and there, which seemed ominous enough. At the time, I personally had no idea where they were leading to, but I love to see it, and I am really happy to say that the show does deliver on this end, as it was hinted by Persephone.
There are consequences to killing a god.
Now, the way they framed dealing with Ember was that of saving Fillory and saving magic, but as it turns out, the consequence of killing a god, as Persephone and others have hinted, is rather dire.
Gods like Ember have parents, you idiot. The old gods, the creators of the universe, of all magic itself. When we're harmless, they ignore us, but when we become malignant, they amputate.
It is not in any way a stretch to claim that Season 3 was the absolute height of the Magicians. Almost every area of the show was excellent throughout it. The basic premise of the season, the loss of magic, is honestly a stroke of genius. I cannot describe just how much I love this idea. I don't believe I have ever seen a fantasy show where magic was deprived in such a way, so it was definitely a unique take for me personally. It quite organically progresses from what was built before, and it certainly is a great escalation. It also serves as a wonderful concept narrative-wise. The loss of magic is inherently a large-scale issue which affects every one of the characters. Therefore, it already gives everyone a motivation to be involved in the plot. There's also a clear endgame, to bring back magic. Automatically, everyone is in on the storyline. Again, this is excellent, and it results in a much more cohesive narrative. The device that he used to move this narrative forward is also rather nice. Elliot encounters a so-called questing creature in Fillory that gives him a quest for the 7 keys that are supposed to unlock magic.
I'll send you on an epic quest.
This undeniably adds a sense of epicness, as now we are seeing the characters follow a magical quest that is larger than any one of them. The way the show uses this narrative device is also just brilliant. I particularly like how they find the keys and where. The quest sends the characters to interesting locations, pairs them up in interesting ways. The writing really uses this device cleverly and to its maximum potential. For instance, the whole ordeal with the fairies, while before seemingly a problem only contained to Fillory, becomes a bigger interest, because one of the keys actually belongs to the fairies. Or for example, Josh becomes an important part of the cast because it is through him that the team has to get a key. Or they find one of the keys in an entirely different timeline where Quentin has become the Beast. Even the key which summons a sort of a depression monster only the person who touched the key can perceive is found in the Abyss, a spot of darkness in Fillory, is a simple but nice thematic choice for the location of the key. The whole quest is simply filled to the brim with interesting concepts and ideas, and honestly I loved every last one of them. There's also the matter of this narrative being an interesting thematic choice. The show, as we have already covered, positions magic as a vice. Characters multiple times remark how magic is a destructive force rather than a helpful one, but this season ponders what happens when the source of destruction is taken away. It plays nicely into this idea of magic being an addiction of sorts, because what do the characters do? They immediately hop into trying to get it back. Even if you take a closer look on an episode basis rather than a whole season arc, the season delivers episode after episode that gets better and better. Of course, the 5th episode of the season titled A Life in the Day, in most people's eyes, is the best episode in the entire show. I do not exactly disagree with the assessment. It certainly is a great episode. But for instance, my personal favorite is the 8th episode of the season titled 6 Short Stories About Magic. It doesn't use a linear structure, but rather chooses to tell the same story from different angles and through POVs of different characters. And that is an interesting choice, and honestly, I love it. Episode 9 titled All That Josh is also amazing. It is a musical episode, but as it is with the Magicians, it is actually a good musical episode. Episode 11 titled 23 slaps as well. This is the episode where Julia and Josh get to team up and detour into an entirely different timeline. It's time manipulation shenanigans and it is really fun. In terms of villains, this time around there really isn't a big overarching villain. Because again, there doesn't have to be. The narrative is already pushed by the characters needing to bring back magic. That is not to say that there aren't any road stops on the way to achieve these goals. There exists the Order of the Library of the Netherlands, who are also interested in bringing back magic, but under certain conditions. There's also the matter of Irene McAllister, a woman who is part of a powerful magical family, who also plots with the Order. Now, before the season concludes, we get some hints here and there that there is something else that is coming.
I saw you opening a lock at the end of the world. You were trying to let magic in, but you let in something much worse.
Which is again, intriguing, ominous, love to see it. The season moves rather elegantly through all of this. That is until we get to the last episode, titled, Will You Play With Me? I cannot say that I dislike this episode. It is a good episode in a sense that it mostly fits, but I do heavily dislike the implications that it leaves us with in regards to what is to come. I will explain this in a bit. The team does manage to bring back magic, but that also didn't come without its own twists and caveats. Basically, everybody loses to some level. They get magic back, but it is heavily regulated by the Order. Julia, after a whole season of working towards growing her magic and becoming a literal deity, loses it all. Some of the characters continue to live, but they do not even know who they are, as the show pulls the character amnesia move for the additional shock value. They also released an insanely powerful monster, a monster who proceeded to then inhabit the body of Elliot.
Will you play with me?
Alice is left to be a prisoner in the library, and also she betrayed her friends. On their own, these conclusions are not as catastrophic. They are relatively okay, at least in the context of the magicians. I wasn't too hyped about, for instance, Julia losing her power she spent an entire season building, but she had to be downgraded for the sake of plot. Now, the primary flaw of the season is that it is simply too good. I mean, whatever was to come next would need to be able to both top the season or match it, and also try to keep up with the plot escalation and progression. You have to remember that this is a fantasy show we are talking about. There is not exactly a path to return to basics. Once the plot and the world of this TV show grows to this extent, the characters simply cannot go back to being inept magicians who know nothing and haven't yet faced threats such as gods. So after delivering the best season of the show, how does the magicians navigate the waters that come after it? If I was to summarize the narrative choices of Season 4, I would say that, in some ways, the show takes the most unexciting paths possible. Now, if we break down the narrative, the main goal is to get the monster to leave Elliot's body. The monster is both the villain and the main mystery of the season, as we do not entirely know what the monster is after and its origins. The show attempts to drop these little clues and hints for the backstory of the monster.
Oh, we'll get him. And I'll get back what he took from me. And then the others, they all took.
The monster is seeking out gods and ripping some magical organs out of them. Why does he do that? There are also the new regulations of the magic supply by the library. They are also an antagonistic force this season. The characters are also under a spell and don't know who they really are. These are the bigger overall issues for the season. One of them, the whole identity change, the show tackles in episode 2, which is good. It would have been really contrived to see them try and draw it out over a longer period of screen time. And also, the whole McAllister thread angle just doesn't really work. They want you to believe that Irene McAllister and her family is this big boogeyman who might come to kill them off any minute now for just existing. Because our characters apparently pose a threat of potentially telling people that they were the ones who saved magic, as the McAllisters decided to paint themselves as the ones who did it instead of the main cast. You mean the family that had, presumably, its most powerful members killed by the fairies? And also, Irene McAllister isn't even there, due to, I believe, the actor's unavailability. So is this threat in the room with us right now? Literally not. I mean, I understand that there might be more family members out there, but again, without Irene, does it really make sense? Is it really that threatening? But also, so what if they do decide to tell someone and try to do anything about it? Isn't Irene now very powerful and influential, as well as in cahoots with the Order? The concept of having a powerful magical family as a threat is not inherently bad. I would say it is a nice addition to the lore of the magicians, but they execute it in the most boring way. A very similar pattern can be observed in practically every other narrative area during the season. Now I want to return back to the idea of progression and escalation. I believe that the first 3 seasons accomplished that very nicely. It introduced concepts throughout the season and, as the show progressed, very nicely elaborated on them, as well as escalated them. One of the more intriguing parts of that, for me personally, was always the so-called Order. The library just always struck me as one of the more intriguing parts of the world building. I mean, we are talking about an organization that has infinite amounts of knowledge and books that detail individual people's lives. Of course that is intriguing. Ever since its inception, the show built upon them, elaborated upon them, and quite frankly made them cooler and cooler. So you would naturally think that the narrative of season 4 would then be the most interesting for me, as now they were being brought out into the forefront. I certainly hoped so. All of that setup of the Order, of these powerful people who are master magicians amounted to a room of like 4 people dressed in gray, headed by some old dude with glasses. I mean, they certainly look like librarians, but oh lord, is that not the most boring reveal ever? That is the order that people are talking about with such reverence? This would not even be that anticlimactic if they actually showed them do something powerful. They are supposedly master magicians who possess magnitudes of knowledge, yet the show simply skips any part of that. It is rather frustrating because the show could have given them something interesting to do instead of simply pretending like these people are imposing. The whole shtick surrounding them is that they protect the flame of knowledge no matter the cost. The last season established that they were into some sketchy methods by showing us that they and Irene McAllister were grinding up fairy bones and consuming them in order to power up. So it is not really out of the realm of possibility that the library could do or contribute to rather horrible things. The fact that they assumed an authority over magic is one of them, but that is the extent of it. They could have taken the Order angle in such interesting directions. Maybe the Order, being empowered with the monopoly over magic, is in pursuit of some other magic. Maybe they are conducting some insane unethical experiments in order to get that magic and discover new disciplines. Maybe they are acquiring knowledge in some really messed up ways. Easily, the show could have used the Order to expand its lore and escalate the scale of the show. These people literally took control over magic, so make them the villains that they were designed to be. Show them doing something cool or messed up with that magic. It is not unlike the show did not try to take this route. They did. There are seeds of it that they set up, suggesting that the head of the Order by the name of Everett has a higher agenda. But first of all, this isn't really an institution-wide effort. This is just one individual doing this and siphoning away magic for himself. Second of all, that is just so plain in comparison to what we have seen before. He is just collecting magic and absorbing it to become a god, to then steal their secrets and bring them to the library. That's it? Especially considering that we already had a whole god journey depicted. The Order wants to have secrets of the gods? Then target Julia and try to get them through her. There are way more exciting and cohesive ways to do this. And even then, Everett fails to become a god, so that whole idea is simply thrown out the window. I understand that these people are librarians, and they certainly look like them, but they do not have to be boring. This is not the first time that this particular season throws out entire ideas that could be very interesting. I am hazarding a guess that Everett's desire to become a god was the show's way of tying together the two primary halves of the season, the Order and the monster. Not a bad idea by any means. This does make the story a bit more cohesive as a whole, but not only is the Order side of the story boring, the monster side is really underwhelming too. At first, I really like what they were going for with the monster. This powerful being, a supposed mistake of the gods, out there wreaking havoc with insane power. A power stronger than those of a single god. A power of multiple gods, in fact. Sounds rather intriguing. It would also be a great escalation in terms of power that the team has to face. Then when he does get to one of the gods, we get some ominous hints about what is going on.
But you don't remember what you are, what you did.
It is up until around episode 9, titled The Serpent, that things go rather decently. Admittedly, I was not really thrilled about the idea of the whole monster's objective being to simply build himself a body that was assumed by the characters. That doesn't really sound exciting at all, at least to me, but it is the magicians. There is always some hope that they will deliver a twist that will be better and mitigate the situation. This time though, they do not. They do the exact opposite. The reveal, the catch, the twist, is that he is actually collecting pieces of his sister in order to piece her back together, and that sister is notably worse than him. On the surface, this sort of twist sounds normal enough. Again, it is an escalation, upping the scales. But this sounds so uninteresting. First of all, we spend a lot of the season to build up the monster, not the monster and the machine. I was personally here for the monster, not the monstress. So for the show to suddenly divert its attention and the narrative focus to this new element of the monster's sister is just not interesting. I suppose I should care about that because it threatens the characters, but admittedly I don't. I really do not. This also misses out on a lot of far more interesting opportunities narrative-wise. Now, the main setup of the monster is that he is a mistake of the old gods. He is shown as vengeful towards the other gods. He is out there to find them and take them down. This of course poses interesting questions. Why is that the case? What did the gods do? I like this ominous presentation, because I always assumed that all of the gods were in danger. No one was safe anymore. All the pantheons were about to be slaughtered because the monster was on a mission of revenge. This grander idea that the gods did something awful and were about to be killed for it sounds epic, but we learned that, oh, it was just like 4 librarians who split up his sister in 4 parts and became gods, and he killed them so he could rebuild his sister, and then they just want to go to the old gods and that's that. I just dislike this idea so much. I don't even feel like I am disliking this for an entirely rational reason. It just feels so flat and boring the way they do it. Imagine if the monster was mowing down gods one after another because there was some big secret that was to be revealed. Imagine the possible magnitude and the implications. During the show airing, I used to visit the subreddit of the magicians quite frequently, and let me tell you, people on there had way more interesting theories than what actually transpired. There's also the matter of 4 human magicians somehow managing to split a being who had powers of many gods. How does that even work? I thought they didn't have enough information about gods that he wanted to rip away their secrets in order to learn about them. Where did he learn to split this powerful being in the first place? Let alone tie the pieces up to some random rocks. How does any of that make sense? In previous seasons when they were killing gods, they literally used power either of other gods or something to that effect in order to deliver the killing blow. Does this imply that somehow the magicians managed to get that type of power? How did he get the sister out of Castle Blackspire? Did he also go through the quest of the 7 keys? I assume that is where they got the sister in the first place, since I am really doubtful that the old god simply handed them that type of power at their request. Yes, this scene does say this.
The old gods themselves provided a solution.
But I doubt that the binder means that literally, that the old gods literally gave away their creations to the library. To quote Alice, to them, to the old gods, people are just...
We're cells.
We are not meant to take those words literally. Same type of questioning can be imposed upon the main character's actions. How come that some random glass vials from Fillory are strong enough to hold these extremely powerful beings? How come they take a couple of sips of the magic pond and suddenly get enough power to pin these beings into these bottles? How do these normal people manage to overpower literal gods? Not even gods, but as the show emphasizes, beings that are as powerful as multiple gods combined. Now, the thing about escalation in fantasy is that if a fantasy story that involves magic and growing stakes runs for long enough, either one of 2 things happen. Either the characters become overpowered and the story needs to invent growing threats, or the characters need to be downgraded in order for the narrative and some sort of a conflict to be able to exist. It is a balancing act. The magicians do these things to some degree. There's also a third option, one that the magicians fall into. That is the story beginning to crack because it can't properly scale. This season is just the example of that. They felt the need to create this powerful monster, this bigger threat than anyone has ever seen before, but they also need to find a way to defeat that monster. So they begin inventing plot holes in order to make that happen. I could see it happening if, for instance, they actually made Julia a goddess and used her knowledge and potential connections to deal with the monster, maybe even in conjunction with the Order. Imagine if these opposing forces were forced to work together against this common threat of the monster. I mean, the monster is both the problem of the library since they had a big hand in releasing him, and also the team since he inhabits Elliot. That might have made a better story. There's also the matter of the old gods. To me, they were the most interesting part of the whole show. They were a piece of lore that sounded so intriguing and so interesting. These are the beings that deprived humans of magic in the first place. They once again alluded to them, and even teased them somewhat through the monster and his sister.
They're more vulnerable than you think, if we can get to their realm.
Which we cannot.
We had a key. Scroll.
And I won't lie, I was kind of rooting for them to show up, but instead we got this.
Hello!
I understand why they weren't there. It would have really messed up the whole power scale if they were suddenly here and present. Then the story would be halted and a lot of things would become meaningless. But why even tease them in the first place, if you won't even do anything with them? They dangle these concepts that could be taken in such cool directions, but ultimately go to waste. There's also the matter of Alice. Now, let us rewind back to Season 3, Episode 8 titled 6 Short Stories About Magic. As I have said, I absolutely loved the episode, and I particularly like the story of Alice. First, the woman who Penny meets in the underworld named Cassandra looks exactly like Alice.
I'm not Alice.
Second, Alice goes to the library and states this.
I want to finish what I started. A grand unified theory of magic.
Now, if you have not already picked up on this, I think The Magicians really has immense potential in its world building. This right here is something that is immensely intriguing in that regard. I earnestly, fervently wanted to see her finish this whole theory she was constructing about magic, but then she decides that magic is evil and should not even exist anymore, which presumably throws away this little hook. Then we get to episode 6 of the 4th season titled A Timeline, Any Place. Here we kind of see her fall back in love with magic a bit, and I honestly hope that they would in some form continue her quest for this grand theory, but nope. This is the one thing I will never forgive the show for. The way it dangles this interesting world building and plot idea and simply tosses it away just because. It's just really disheartening. I personally always felt that between this
I'm not Alice.
and this,
A grand unified theory of magic.
there is a really interesting story, but all of that, as it turns out, was in my head. Besides this season taking the most unexciting routes possible, there were also some good things. Some of the smaller storylines and the episodes work well enough on their own. The keyword here, on their own. We will discuss it later. For example, the episode we touched upon, A Timeline and a Place, was relatively good. It explored another timeline, once again, and it had its fun with it. All that is great. The Margo-centric episode, Hard Glossy Armor, is probably the height of the season. So it is not like the season is comprised only of lows. Now, the overall build-up to the finale was, I think, genuinely scary. Seeing the monsters massacre librarians, the team moving in place right before the finale, we also had a cliffhanger that was hanging over our heads all this time, indicating that something serious was gonna go down. Season 5 is quite an interesting beast. In terms of progression, it makes sense. In terms of escalation, it also makes sense. The main problem that the team faces now is the potential destruction of worlds, both Earth and Fillory. I suppose it only makes sense for the last season to be centered around the apocalypse, a literal end of all things. In terms of storytelling, the narrative is cohesive. Everyone has the same goal. Everyone is involved, but this season also feels like now the writers laid back and began throwing everything they had at the wall. Want a zombie type situation? You got it. Want a heist? Yep, it is there. A musical? Yep. A little mystery? It's there. It has everything, and it doesn't really hold back. As a last season, I can appreciate that somewhat. But I guess a lot of the effort and thought that was back in the first 3 seasons just goes out the window. I guess this season also goes a bit full circle. In many ways, it is a return to what The Magician started out as. The season begins with a new status quo for many characters. Fillory is now 300 years ahead. The world now has an overabundance of magic. We get to return to Breakbills that we first knew it as, a place for education. We get to rediscover Fillory from scratch again. Without the main characters being its rulers, magic is no longer in deficit. So up until episode 6, the characters deal with the earthly apocalypse, and they succeed. Afterwards, they focus entirely on Fillory. And I think that the Fillory storyline this time around was really interesting. I found myself enjoying the whole mystery surrounding the Dark King. The reveal of it being Rupert Chatwin was also nice. It again went back to the basics of the Magicians. We also get to see the return of the Beast. The destruction of Fillory is epic, if you ignore certain facts. For example, we see the Beast make an appearance. The problem with the Beast is that first, he is still somehow a threat to the characters. Now, usually the way that villains and antagonists are defeated within a narrative is that the protagonists find a way to overpower them. Not necessarily physically, but I feel as though it should make the characters reach a level where they are stronger and more experienced. Yet when we come around to season 5, the people who defeated the Beast all the way back in season 1 still feel very threatened by him. This, I suppose, does make sense, as he was defeated with the help of a temporary power-up. But while the characters are somehow threatened by a villain that they already defeated, you have to remember that since then they have faced bigger threats that would have used the Beast to wipe the floors, and it just does not make for good storytelling. Entire seasons of experience went out the drain. I mean, we see the Beast kill the super smart Master Magician Zelda just like that, yet we also see the Beast be crushed by a Florian column. It is a fine season. It is a fun season, and a tiny bit better than the 4th. As I have said, it throws everything at the wall. Nothing is off the table. It has a lot of fun, so naturally it is a fun season. Not much is particularly notable in comparison to other seasons though, which I suppose is the problem. The show didn't really try to be inventive or subversive anymore. It felt like a regular generic show about magic. The one element that is rather strange is how they progressed the thread of the Order. I find it hard to believe that every one of these master magicians just decided to collectively throw in the towel after the monster and his sister killed some librarians. We are talking about people who believe that they must sacrifice themselves if there is a threat to knowledge. We have seen that happen. So it is really weird that there is no one from inside the order to step up to the job, and they just abandon it collectively and let it be run down? It's just not plausible. This isn't the only area where the show becomes inconsistent within itself. For instance, back in season 3, we have the character of the fairy queen sacrifice herself for her own people. Irene McAllister kills her, as they make a deal.
No fairy will be hunted by a non-fairy anywhere, ever. And this deal cannot be broken for any reason by any being, ever.
Season 5, however, makes a rather big deal about how fairies are being hunted, again, but at the end of the day, the way the magician's narrative concludes is rather nice in tone compared to other season finales. For once, the characters get a decent ending. It is undeniable that throughout its run, the magician takes its audience through quite an interesting ride. Whether it always succeeds at making that ride a quality one is, as we have discussed, up for debate. Do not fret, there is still some discussion to be had later on about certain choices. In the meantime, I must make an admission. This is the perspective I used to see the show through. I have personally been a fan of the show ever since it first started airing. I was there from the very beginning, and I was way younger. Therefore, my primary interest was in the entertainment value that the show brought. Of course, I didn't go out of my way to notice the flaws. I wasn't as receptive to them back then. It is why I felt compelled to discuss the magicians in the first place. Up until this point, this is what the original discussion would have mostly been if it came from that version of myself. But revisiting the show with a new mind and a new perspective allowed me to see a lot of things that I simply missed. And we may have lengthy discussions as to how the show handles its plots and narratives. But it is also important to look at what sort of people the show chooses to craft to place into those narratives and this crooked magical world. Yet, it is even more important to see what type of message the show chooses to send. Kas yra fantastika? Ar signal ar veidrodis? Troks aš neaucis get savīt, kad srapsong šeirbiv. Magic may be displayed as a destructive force, but is it actually destructive on its own, or only at the hands of its users? What if the approach the magician's takes can not only be considered a dark one, but rather a realistic, a grounded approach? There is an interesting idea that lies at the very core of the magic system that magicians has.
Funny little irony they don't tell you. Magic doesn't come from talent, it comes from pain.
This is the governing principle that permeates the character writing within the show. You see, this approach within itself carries an interesting implication as to what a person is supposed to be in order to actually be a magician. If magic comes from pain, it can be assumed that more likely than not, a magician has gone through some considerable amount of trauma in order to gain their affinity to magic. This implication is rather grim, but this is in keeping with a grander idea that the magicians proposes, a twisted version of a magical world, which is how the show finds its characters. The starting point in which we first meet them, none of them are particularly likable. This, I would say, makes complete sense. Again, it takes a particular person to become a magician. After all, the world of magic is the way it is probably because the magicians are the way they are. Do powerful magical families exist because they perpetuate abuse, and thus keep the connection of magic? Through the cycles of pain family members may cause to one another, which is why this show is not as broad in its appeal. Characters are very much human. Not unlike any other area of the show, the magicians takes a rather gritty, and perhaps even a realistic path in order to construct its characters. It does not shy away from their flaws, sometimes to an extreme extent. Characters are portrayed as selfish, irresponsible, disgusting to one another because they are pushed and pulled by the very human forces from within. Now, in a lot of other shows, as well as discourses surrounding them, everything usually operates in a binary, meaning that characters are supposed to adhere and behave in some specific logic. I believe that The Magicians, for its benefit and to its detriment, does not fall into this trap. It is true that characters should follow a sense of logic. After all, characterization operates on establishing an internal logic of a character. But I do believe that there exists a place for irrationality. Humans by any means are not linear. We do not behave the same always. Our behaviors are highly influenced by situations, even our own mood. So why is the same chain of thought not extended towards fictional characters? It is a human variable that needs to be recognized. I believe that this is the logic that the magicians also exercises. Therefore, it is a rather difficult task to discern or quantify certain characters in certain moments. And that is not entirely what I will try to do next. What I have just described now has a very simple term for it: nuance. We have already established that the world the magicians shows is not one of joy and wonder, but rather the opposite. It takes a cynical, twisted approach instead. Or again, perhaps a realistic one. But now as we approach more difficult waters, I want us to ponder. As you may have noticed, I neglected to discuss some areas of the show. This was done deliberately. On the surface, one might mistake the approach that the magicians offers towards its characters and the whole show as one of nuance simply because it is driven by a radically opposite approach towards what is conceived as the main characteristics of magic. Yet, one must not forget, an opposite position towards what is established is also a position that can lack nuance. And at times, this TV show does offer nuance. The show has its moments when it can be perceived as complex and complicated. But the more interesting question is, what happens when it doesn't offer the nuance that is required? What happens when a show is so focused on being subversive and bold that the boldness can no longer be called that? What happens when boldness turns into recklessness? What happens when all this creates a tunnel vision and the show develops blind spots? What is fantasy? It is a form of speculative fiction. Its primary aim is to depict a world that can be radically different from our own. It uses that world to depict what kind of society, what kind of people would inhabit it. It explores possibilities, and it extrapolates from ideas. The Magicians is no different. While it aims to deconstruct and to challenge the tropes of fantasy, it does not exactly try to take itself seriously. It is still in a position to offer a vision, a window into a world that is governed by different rules. But it also, at its core, can be a mirror that reflects our society back at us, a metaphor for issues that exist in real life, a reality within this unreal world. With contemporary media, it seems as though pieces of fiction are becoming more and more cognizant of how they portray their characters. This inherently is a very good thing. I am a believer that media, while this not always being the case, certainly can have influence over the people that consume it. So if media manages to incite discussion towards the right direction of course being quite a subjective variable in itself, that is ultimately a good thing. The Magicians, I feel as though, too attempts to be cognizant in its portrayals of characters. From what I understand, it attempts to position itself as subversive in more ways than one. It also tries to be progressive and complex in ways that other shows might not be. This is the key word here, attempts. But whether it achieves that, it is up to question. The truth is that, for the sake of this video, it is not even exactly relevant to evaluate what type of message it tries to put out. What is way more important is how exactly it is communicated. You may wonder how it relates to the idea of deconstruction of fantasy. The relation you will find is rather simple. Fantasy narratives are commonly associated with wonder, sometimes danger, yes, but it is escapism. The Magicians takes a very opposite approach. I have come to believe that the Magicians does this to an extreme extent, and ultimately to its detriment. Sometimes the decisions that stem from trying to be subversive directly contradict the supposedly progressive and complex stance that it takes. The show aims more so for shock value that they position as subversion and deconstruction rather than soundness of what they are trying to say. It values more making noise without fully realizing the implications. There are multiple points in the show that pertain to this pattern. Perhaps it is most fruitful to begin with the biggest. The Magicians arguably made the most waves during its run when it decided to kill off one of its main characters, Quentin Coldwater. If you believe that he was the main character, I do not blame you. The show ultimately asserts this to be the case. Of course, the show tries to postulate about how there are other characters who can be main characters, yet still Quentin, by both the writers and the audience, was mostly approached as the main character, so his death had quite large implications. While the fandom, to put it lightly, imploded, we as fans at the time also received a small media tour from showrunners of the show. With such a bold decision, naturally they had to go ahead and explain themselves. They happened to provide an interview for The Hollywood Reporter. The article itself is illuminating. What it boils down to is that they wanted to subvert the trope of the main male protagonist being safe within the story, which I guess I can see the logic. Not every writer has the gumption to kill off a lead. You may think that it isn't right to look at this article at all, and that it is unfair to inject outside sources over a standalone TV show. This is a valid point, but the magicians also told us this in a very, very unambiguous way.
Quentin's the center of the whole thing. You have a classic case of white male protagonism, Derek.
So consider this interview, if anything, a reiteration of what was presented in the show, as well as a confirmation of the intent. From purely my own view, I would say that the death of Quentin was a big mistake, from the marketing standpoint, as well as from a narrative perspective. If you are within the fandom, you must have heard the rumors of the actor Jason Ralph wanting to leave the show, forcing the writers to remove his character from the narrative in some way. Whichever is actually the case, it ultimately hurts the show way more than it benefits it. The writers might try to gaslight you into thinking otherwise, but this decision is really misguided and their attempts to cover it are ridiculous. The thing with Quentin is that he already in many ways was subversive. If anything, this interview comes off as rather oblivious to what the show has already told us about Quentin, or any other characters in fact. It is very reductive to say that he was a white male lead. I mean, sure, if we are reducing people to tags, he was. But for a show that allegedly aims to bring complexity to its characters, the writers reducing him to that comes off as strange. It is as if they do not already establish that this character has mental health issues and is queer. Obviously, these things are not his only character traits, but this combination in itself is already not as common in media. He is also subversive in other ways. While we start off mostly with him and get the entry into the magical world through him, he is not really the main character. He is in a sense that we follow him rather closely, but in terms of narrative importance, Quentin probably has the least weight in the grand scheme. Other characters receive a lot more to do than he does. Elliot and Margo become the High King and Queen instead of him. Alice gets to defeat the Beast. Julia saves him from the Beast. Elliot gets the quest for the 7 keys and not Quentin. There are way more examples of this. Sure, Quentin gets to kill a god, but other characters have arguably been pulling a lot more weight than him. That was the thing about Quentin. He wasn't the most important one. He was not the one to save the world all the time. It was a team effort. Not to mention the fact that even despite all the things that the show puts him through, Quentin perseveres despite his mental health struggles, and he himself understands that he's not the most important one, and he still keeps going. Again, unpopular opinion, but I never actually thought of Quentin as the main character. The show made a big effort to show that this was always an ensemble. That is what I liked about the show. This made Quentin somewhat relatable as the underdog, and it also had plenty of other interesting characters. That was a good subversion. It feels as though the show misunderstood that and began pushing onto us again that Quentin was in fact a male white protagonist. They killed him off to show that he is not safe, but he also managed to kill off one of the most complex characters. He wasn't just a white male lead. Quite frankly, the fact that he did this and framed it in this way speaks more about their own biases than anything else. What I feel from this interview is not really complexity, but rather the showrunners patting themselves on the back for something that they do not really do. What this ultimately tells me as a viewer that they do not value the complexity. They sought out shock value of attempting to subvert and deconstruct. Again, it is telling that they emphasize the subversion rather than anything else. The show has always been like this to some extent, ever since season 1. You can view this episode as a bit of a culmination of the two sides of the plot, of Quentin discovering how the magic he thought was real is actually rather corrupted, and Julia progressing from not believing in it to fully appreciating magic. Again, they end up on opposite ends of where we began with them, and I fully believe that it should have been kept this way. What is indicated here is that there is nuance in this magical world. There is good and there is bad. There is a balance. There are differing opinions on what it can do, and there are different outcomes to magic that depend on how people use it or get to it. There is also another subtext here that is important to point out. Julia goes through a whole arc where she finds her own way of magic. She comes out of a dark place and carves her own path towards happiness, and only after that she gets to fully join the magical world, along with the rest of the cast. There are a couple of important things to remember for what comes next. The whole deal with her being cast out in this timeline away from everyone in order to find that magic and that strength is not even implied. but, and this will be important later, very clearly stated to be pivotal in defeating the Beast. After all, Jane Chatwin alters something within a timeline with an assumption that it might help to bring down the Beast. It is also important to remember that the Beast at this point is also assumed to be Christopher Plover, the person who wrote Fillory and further. In regards to what comes next, Julia also can be seen as assuming the position that Quentin originally assumed, of being a believer in magic and it being a force for good. But, from what we already saw, Quentin gets proven wrong. What comes next, to summarize, is that Julia is also proven wrong, and this, in one full sweep, changes absolutely everything. This episode is the finale of the first season, and it delivers two main reveals. The first reveal is that what Julia believed happened after she summoned the god was a complete fabrication. She, just like Quentin, gets proven wrong in her belief. As it is revealed, she was sexually assaulted by a god. This carries huge implications for everything that occurred during the season. It turns out that Julia was cast out in the cold, as they say, to get stronger. But to get stronger, she had to go through an unimaginable thing. This, from a thematic standpoint, sadly makes sense. We are talking about a world which is governed by a simple rule. Magic doesn't come from a good place. It comes from pain. This is the theme that is ultimately reflected in the storyline of Julia. You see, the fact that she had to go through this, because of a decision made by someone else, is really disturbing. The implication here is that the timeline was changed in order for her to have to experience this. Not only that, the show uses this to double down upon this idea that it has, that the magic world is just plain bad. Before, it showed that characters can find happiness within it. Now it was just plainly dark and negative, and due to this, devoid of any real nuance. It is a cynical approach, and it also seems to be imposing an extreme point onto the narrative that makes the story so insanely negative. Again, this is in keeping with the overall theme. And how does the show address this revelation that Julia was supposed to go to break pills, but was forced out by someone to go through all this pain? The show does not really address the angle of someone pushing her into this position in a meaningful way. It brushes way past that. It could have been a nuanced discussion to be had if the show actually understood what this whole situation entailed. We can also go a step backwards. When the Beast first enters this world, he goes very specifically after Quentin. This also carries an interesting implication. Because he targets Quentin, it implies that he had prior knowledge of what is to come, and he did, as the Beast can see other timelines. This, in a way, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because Quentin would never be set on a particular path against the Beast had he not been attacked by him, and the show deciding to position the Beast as the villain right from the get-go. He targets them not because they have really done something to the Beast, but because the Beast knows they pose a threat to his plans in the future. This whole thing is born out of a preventative nature, and not because the characters do something in particular. This begs the question, why doesn't anyone in the show then simply try not to create such a situation where this all occurs in the first place, by also preventing Quentin from even being in that sort of a position? Obviously, because the plot wouldn't happen. But imagine if, instead of Julia, Quentin gets cast out. Better yet, not even ever offered the opportunity to attend break pills. Somehow, it had to be specifically Julia who had to suffer, but not Quentin, who could have simply stayed in his regular life and not have his whole outlook on Fillory be completely shattered. You could also say that he would still find a way, or that Alice would still have called upon her brother. Sure, that might have happened, but then we can take another step back. As we have established, this all happens because of someone interfering and assuming an authority over what would happen. That person is Jane Chatwin, who also operates under the alias of Eliza. She can be seen as a helper in this fantasy narrative, but her position in the story is radically changed by both reveals within the episode. The second main revelation that the show delivers is that the Beast isn't Christopher Plover, it is Martin Chatwin. It was revealed in the first season that Plover sexually assaulted Martin Chatwin multiple times. You see, the team operated under the assumption that it was Plover who was the Beast, because his heinous actions very much support this thesis. And it is also important to note that because this was the main theory, everything shown to this point supported exactly this theory. A lot of other potential considerations were omitted. Now, what do I mean by this? For example, what is the real role of Jane Chatwin in all of this? Not a lot of thought is paid towards what she did, towards her actions. We must get one thing straight. What happened to Martin Chatwin is in no way her fault. She, just like her brother, was a child. She cannot be blamed that it happened. But I do think that she handled what happened after really poorly. It is in this exact episode that Quentin and Julia travel backwards in time, and it is revealed that they actually have a cameo in the Fillory books. This is where they encounter the young Martin Chatwin, a boy who desperately wanted to find a way into Fillory to run away from the abuse that he was suffering. And by that point, that is how we, as an audience, still know him. This is still happening before the twist. Do you know what else they encounter while there? Jane Chatwin. Again, this is happening before the twist, which is why this, upon first viewing, seems innocuous. But when you learn that Martin becomes the Beast, it only begs the question, why didn't she do anything after? Sure, when it was happening, she could not prevent it. But here we have Martin who comes into Fillory where older Jane is. A Jane who has already lived multiple timelines and who knows a lot of things already. One might say that she may not have known what exactly went down between Plover and Martin. On that now, excuse my French, I have to say, bullshit. There is far more evidence to suggest that she is aware of a lot, if not all, of the things that are happening and how they are happening. And there is absolutely zero way she did not know who the Beast was. Therefore, there had to come a moment where she had to guess what exactly led to Martin to become the Beast in the first place. After all, this is her twin brother we are talking about. Also, if she followed the timelines as closely as it is implied, it couldn't be the first time the main characters are finding out who the Beast is and why exactly he is the way he is. I assume their investigation happened in at least a couple of timelines, and I am probably lowballing here. I don't buy that she was never around to find out when the twist hit in other timelines. That is the problem. Quentin and Julia didn't know, therefore they couldn't do anything. We as the audience didn't know either, but she knew that the Beast, while absolutely becoming an irredeemable monster later on, did not start out as one. And as the show displays, she was literally within the reach of Martin before he went to the wellspring, before he became the Beast. Of course, him becoming the Beast can also be attributed a bit to the gods of Fillory, who repeatedly shut him out when he needs sanctuary away from Plover, but the show never portrays these gods as anything else than awful. Jane, however, is portrayed as a helper to the team, a mentor in a way, but it is also through some of her own actions that these characters get into this awful situation in the first place. The show does not consider this at any point, because up until the reveal, it always operated under the assumption that Plover, and by extension the Beast, was just straight up a monster. The show really doesn't display much of a shift in the underlying assumptions about its villain and the sequence of events after the identity reveal, and that was how the show made a leap from the abuse victim becoming the irredeemable villain of the show in one swoop. This also implies that a lot of what Quentin and his team go through could have been avoided. Julia's abuse could have been avoided, if only Jane Chatwin actually used her power to mitigate the situation she knew would occur in the future. And while this scene does exist,
find a way back. Find the Beast. Kill him.
If I could manage that, we'd be sharing a drink right now.
I personally don't find this sufficient. I expect a way more fleshed out explanation considering that there are literal lives at stake here, and not a simple throwaway line. Returning to the idea of this timeline being a self-fulfilling prophecy, I fibbed a little. This isn't entirely true. This is actually all put in place by Jane Chatwin herself. She is the one who gives Quentin the Fillory and further book 6 at the beginning of episode 1, which then leads Quentin to break pills. Jane then proceeds to lead Quentin to Alice, which leads Alice and Quentin to summon the Beast in the first place. The show addresses the need for this specific acceleration of events.
The sigil that appeared on your hand brought you to Alice. That was Jane trying to get the ball rolling, trying to get you all together working fast.
But there is something that the show does not address. That is the fact that Jane, instead of using her powers as we have discussed and actually fixing the situation herself, opts to choose Quentin specifically. She is the one who puts absolutely everything in place. In this instance, the show pretends like it is taking a step forward while in reality it is taking 2 steps back. You see, Jane again makes this decision because Quentin is this big believer in Fillory and he is the one who always volunteers. But Jane can also be seen as a vehicle for the writers to impose decisions that are supposed to make the plot happen. This further can be split into a few perspectives. Either Jane is a misogynist and rather dumb and these are intentional character traits. This could be true if the show actually acted like this was the case, or there is a second option. These are traits that brought about these writing decisions in the first place. And I am saying this because the show is simply oblivious to this. Jane literally pushed Julia out of break pills to save Quentin for him to succeed in defeating the Beast. And Julia saves him because she was sexually assaulted and gained power. And she gained this power because of that sexual assault. And this is just yet another layer of strangeness that the show is wrapped around. Because in this very episode, it is shown that both Alice and Julia have to consume male god semen in order to get power. They also make a joke about it.
Wow. Swallowing has its privileges.
Which is just a bit misogynist. The whole first season literally boils down to the fact that Jane, the writer's room insert, chose this one random guy who loves Fillory to make plot happen, with this choice then ruining a lot of lives in the process. Then the show proceeds to tell you that actually they are addressing the white male perspective, and that he is not actually the typical white male main character. I am sorry, but then why choose him in the first place? I think that this is consistent with the mentality behind his death. I guess it makes sense this in the context of that article, the plot inherently chooses Quentin as the main character, and quite obviously so. There is a certain irony in them accelerating the plot in this particular way, with Jane going out of her way to pick a white male protagonist, then them trying to prove that she was in fact wrong in her choice, by Quentin himself vocalizing this.
I want to be the one. I do. It's the adult part of me. The part of me that understands how magic works. It just keeps screaming that it's you.
And then them walking back on that decision to facilitate this big shocking twist of his death. The most simple explanation is that the show was subverting the chosen one trope, but it had enough ability to say only that Jane was only wrong about choosing Quentin, yet not enough ability to say that she was wrong in denying Julia what was rightfully hers. Jane, whether we like it or not, was playing God with her abilities, quite literally. I want to emphasize that I am not petitioning for the show to not display any of this at all, but I am petitioning for it to be displayed in a different way. Jane is the archetypal quest giver mentor character, yes. The show is trying to be subversive, yes. With Jane, the show still falls into the typical fantasy trap of having a mentor character who, instead of giving all of the information, proceeds to act cryptic for no specific reason. Tell me there was a reason for her not to simply go to Quentin and tell him all there was to know about the beast. No, instead of telling him, she remained silent. I would have liked for the show to have pointed this out, because when you consider it all, this is just Chatwin family conflict into which the cast of characters get dragged into, and even then the person who dragged them into it in the first place proceeds to act all cryptic and secretive about it. It would have been a really good deconstruction if the show provided this commentary through Quentin. To poke fun and criticize the role of the mentor in a fantasy narrative, there is always an argument to be made that the show opted not to do this, to be subtle, and leave the audience to analyze and figure all of this out themselves. Yet, the show was never subtle about anything fantasy related really, and in only this particular instance the show suddenly invents subtlety. It just doesn't really track with the whole meta angle the show goes for throughout its run. All of this leads me to a single conclusion, that the show prioritized the shock power of these supposed twists, rather than the repercussions and the implications. And all of this was born because the show wanted to deliver these plot twists. A lot of this could have been avoided if they did not. You could say that this is the point of the show, perhaps this is the intention, to portray Jane Chatwin as this cruel person who did all of this. But no, I think it makes her character stupid, the plot ends up full of holes, and the show is not as smart, complex, and subversive as it wants to be. Let's consider another perspective. If the show took this into account and explored this edge, I think it could have been both in theme of the show and could have been a more powerful emotional punch as well as a potentially deeper exploration. Imagine if these questions were raised within the show itself, if the characters considered all of these variables. But again, it brushes past things Jane could or could not have done and continues to put her in a position of a helper. These considerations are not without their caveats. There's also the question of whether Jane could be blamed for what happened to Julia simply because she prevented her from getting into break pills. Julia ended up where she ended up more so due to a chain reaction, and not specifically through Jane consciously inserting her into that particular situation. This again is a gray area that the show could have explored, because according to the show, this plan works, but I think it doesn't really consider to what end and at what cost. What particularly pains me is that they already set grounds for this to happen. As I have mentioned, Season 1 plays on the idea of a chosen one, as Quentin is the one named by the beast, as well as Jane choosing him, and Quentin himself already says that.
I want to be the one. I do.
If only they pushed this idea further, they could have achieved way more gravitas in their storytelling, because it does transform Jane from the helper position into a potentially antagonistic force from the point of view of the characters. It could leave Quentin with the dreadful realization that he was not in fact the chosen one, and that he, as well as others, would have benefited way more from not being chosen at all. There's also another dimension that is added to the situation. Towards the end of this episode, Julia and Martin Chatwin are paired up. This sets up an interesting dynamic. In some ways, the circumstances surrounding Julia and Martin can be seen as similar. Both of them were not exactly accepted into the magical world. Julia couldn't get into break pills, and Martin was shut out of Fillory. People they knew were accepted, yet they were not able to get into this world. Because of that, both of them suffered at the hands of others. In many ways, they are victims. The way their arcs progress are also somewhat similar. Both of them seek retribution against their abusers. Martin manages to torture Plover, and Julia wants to deal with Reynard. They both, at some point, also lose their shades. The core difference is the ending that they receive from those situations. Julia stays alive and manages to remain good while the Beast gets defeated. The core difference is that one of them indeed did have a support system, while the other was all alone. This, I think, is an effective and subtle way to show how different circumstances of that type of situation can produce different results. But also, another core difference is that their deeds are treated way differently by the show while they are shadeless. Beast obviously does a lot of bad things. Julia also does a thing that is not as good. And the burning of that forest sounds rather serious.
You burn down the one-way forest while I'm trying to wiggle us out of a full-on war? They were endangered. Now trees all over Fillory are enraged and calling for action.
But no one really treats it as that. What I dislike here is that Julia is being held by a different standard by the show. Her act is treated as a misstep rather than an action that has real and grim consequences on an entire populace. She gets to commit genocide but then say, oh, I do not have to do this, and then simply move on. Then why couldn't the Beast? There are a few possibilities for the difference in treatment. One of them is that the show already went in with a certain bias towards these characters. The Beast was always intended to be the villain. Julia is a main character, hence why she can kill off an entire population and go back to Earth like nothing happened. The second option goes back to the idea of deconstruction of fantasy. Fantasy worlds in fiction are whimsy and are treated as this larger-than-life thing. The magicians treat this whimsy as if it is really stupid. It doesn't take the world of Fillory seriously at all. It is merely the playground for the main characters to play with. This is yet another glaring issue that the show has in its approach. Not only does it try to get as much shock value as possible, but it also refuses to take Fillory seriously in order to be subversive. It ridicules Fillory constantly, and if you think this is not bad, it inherently is not for the purpose that they are trying to achieve. It is just that, in its attempts to be subversive, the show simply becomes hypocritical. Season 4 is truly the gift that keeps on giving. This episode focuses on rather different perspectives than that of a white male protagonist. Inherently a nice idea, but also a bit funny considering what has happened before in the show. One of the storylines this episode shines a spotlight upon is one of Fen's. A lovely character, love to see her, happy she's here. Also funny how the show is insanely oblivious to her perspective. To understand the gripes that they have, we must first take a glance at her story in the show. Not how the show frames the story, but rather how she herself would have experienced it. I want us to do something that, ironically, the show never does. Actually put ourselves in her shoes. We first meet her back in season 1. She is the daughter of a knife maker. One day, people of Earth arrive to Fillory, and her father, in exchange of giving the knife that could kill the Beast to the main cast, marries her to a complete stranger who is supposed to become a High King of Fillory. The wedding occurs, and she indeed becomes the wife of the High King from Earth named Elliot. Then we come to season 2. These random people from Earth assume the thrones of her homeland, and she becomes their subject, but she doesn't really see much of a problem with it. That is how Fillory works, and she has accepted it seemingly. This group then proceeds to make fun of practically every tradition or custom that Fillory has. They crap all over what she has grown up with. She gets subjected to countless acts of casual xenophobia from these people, but again, she goes on and perseveres. Way to send a message of inclusivity too. She proceeds to find out that her husband is not exactly interested in her sexually, as he is gay, but she still trucks forward, takes it rather well and is an ally. But she does manage to consummate the marriage with her husband. Then she becomes pregnant, and then one of these people tell her that she will have to give away her child in order to save her husband. Of course, the part where people tell her what she would actually have to do is omitted, but she, being the sweet cinnamon roll that she is, agrees. She wants to help her husband and be a dutiful wife. Let's remember that these random ass people just came in and put her in this situation. She did not really decide any of this. Then she finds out that it is her child that they want to take away from her, and then she gets abducted by fairies. She's taken hostage to another realm. She is then held prisoner in that realm. Fen then gives birth to the child, and Margo offers Fen to go back to Fillory. But obviously Fen wants to be where her newborn is. She was really excited about the pregnancy, so she wants to be with her child. She then sacrifices part of her body, her toes, only to get back to Elliot Elliot and Margo and warn them about the incoming fairy occupation. Again, she's trying to help these random people who came from another world. She's being dutiful still. Now, let us process this. Let's ask ourselves a simple question. Wouldn't that chain of events be insanely traumatic for someone? Honestly, her journey thus far sounds more like a villain origin story than anything else. Let's not forget that the show doesn't really give any of this proper screen time. It leaves all of this to either jokes or character moments for other characters. Now, you probably won't guess what season 3 does with all of this. It proceeds to treat all of this as a joke. It treats Fen as a joke. She is displayed as caring for a log who she dresses up as a baby. I mean, if that doesn't indicate severe trauma, what else can? The show repeatedly plays with this as a bit of a gag through the first few episodes. Let's not forget, she gave away her child, was abducted purely for the betterment of our main characters. And yet, she is continuously being mistreated. Margo, the person who is responsible for her losing her child, continues to take jabs at Fen every chance she gets. Elliot at least shows her some amount of respect, but ends up scoffing at her very real trauma of her child being taken away from her.
3 hours ago, my wife was burping a log.
Margo never even really acknowledges what she has done to Fen. She acknowledges the blame for the situation, but only in regards to Elliot back in season 2.
Jesus.
Fen wouldn't come because I have your daughter. I'm sorry.
Further into the season, Fen gets to find out that her daughter is actually dead. Only then does the show suddenly remember that Fen is not just a doormat for other characters to wipe their boots at, that she is an actual person. This lasts for a good few seconds, I think, before we return to the regular programming of her being reduced to a joke again. Even when the show does decide to explore this edge to Fen, it is only in servitude of the Julia storyline. The season provides another glimpse into what Fen has to go through. When a rebellion, and honestly very validly so, breaks out in Fillory, Fen acknowledges her situation.
Now those boys want to drop you off a waterfall, and that's them being polite. What do you think they would do if they got their hands on me?
And this scene alone is really good. It goes to acknowledge that she also has feelings and is going through things. Then comes around season 4. You see, the end of season 3 left her to be the acting High King of Fillory. She was stepping in for the main characters, which is actually not a bad choice. Fen deserves at least something for what she has been going through, and then she goes on to rule Fillory for a longer period of time. But then this gets taken away from her. She immediately gives back the crown to Margo without any questions whatsoever, because she is being respectful. And then she finds out that her husband is potentially dead. She, of course, reacts with reasonable emotion. She grieves. You have to remember that in the span of a few years, she has already lost her child and now her husband. This is then reduced to yet another joke.
That wasn't as bad as I expected.
Yeah, just 2 short hours.
What are you doing? The last lay. The widow lays in her marital bed, buried in the garments of her deceased love.
But we need them for the memorial. Who else will sing the bleats of despair?
In this instance, the show prioritizes making fun of the magical world's traditions. Because again, Fillory is a joke, and casual xenophobia, even if against a non-existent world, is actually really cool and subversive. And you should definitely laugh at another culture if it seems ridiculous to you. Then comes the 7th episode of this season. This is supposed to be the episode that is an integral part of setting up the main thesis behind the death of Quentin. This episode right here postulates so loudly and so blatantly about the importance of perspectives. Penny remarks that
when you file people away as sidekicks, you don't realize their importance to the story, and this story belongs to a lot more people than you think.
And then everyone clapped. Again, it is inherently a nice idea, if only it held true within the show itself. As we have discussed just now, Fen has been consistently demeaned within the show, both by other characters and the narrative. So now imagine the whiplash when this episode tries to convince you that Fen is an important character within the story. You see, it is very hilarious in the context of this episode that Fen was never afforded even a shred of thought when it came to her characterization. This character alone went through so much, but her struggles were never really paid any attention at all and brushed under the rug to service other characters and the plot. You can sort of see why this was the case. Again, the show bends over backwards to be subversive and grown up. It ridicules the trope of a fantasy world that seems so childish. To them, Fen is not a regular human, she is a Fillorian, and therefore not worthy of the same treatment others receive. Which is ironic when they focus so much on the white male protagonist perspective. Because yes, Quentin loses someone he loves, Alice, and gets to grieve properly. The show doesn't make cheap jabs at his character for for it. His father dies and he gets an entire episode devoted to his grief and backstory. He throws those airplanes his father built at the wall, yet I don't see any Fillorian or Earthling and side-cracking jokes about it how weird it seems to them. This goes out to all of the so-called main characters. They all get that treatment. Fen doesn't because she's a side character, and she also happens to be from the cheap joke factory that is Fillory. Again, this part could be, if not fine, at least half okay. She's only a side character, so there's no time to delve into her character, right? Which goes directly against what this very episode tries to say. Not to mention the fact that all their grandstanding about mental health is ultimately undermined by their treatment of Fen. So what? If you are not the main character, your traumas do not matter? Are some mental health issues supposed to be ridiculed while others are not? Is the loss that Fen experiences of less value than the losses other characters experience just because she is from Fillory? Either all of it is funny, or none of it is. You simply cannot do one thing and then pretend to do another. With the magicians, it's just a moving target. The philosophy of the show as a whole, as much as they would like you to believe otherwise, is a moving target. Some of the sentiment also carries over to the very next episode. Fen ventures out on her quest to find the woman who appears in her dreams, a questing creature called the Napster. She ventures out with Margo. There are a few scenes in particular that seem to be clashing with the idea of perspectives and importance of characters just from the previous episode. Fen manages to throw in some Earth culture references after her brief stint on Earth back in season 3.
Do you think we're learning secret fighting skill?
When did you watch The Karate Kid?
She's called the Napster.
Like the music sharing site?
I seriously underestimate you sometimes, you know that?
The show, I think, uses this scene as a way to show that Fen is becoming a bit more important in terms of being a character in the show, and finally gaining a shred of respect from the person that bullies her all the time. But the way she achieves this is by displaying knowledge of Margo's culture. Again, we are supposed to glean from the last episode that the perspective of Fen matters, right? But it only really matters in the sense that it is used to contribute to the perspectives of the main characters. Margo has been laughing at Fillory repeatedly, yet she doesn't receive scrutiny from it from Fen. Fen accepts the perspective that the Earthlings have without really questioning it, while they proceed to dunk on her culture and her way of life unapologetically right in front of her. And the only way for her to earn respect is to shed her own culture and accept theirs. I think that it is quite possible that Fen would also find some of Earth's traditions funny, but the show doesn't agree with this statement. It does agree with the opposite, that Fillory is just hilarious to Earthlings. So forgive me that I'm not exactly salivating at the show stating the obvious, that there does exist more than one perspective in the story, because it comes off as disingenuous when it seems so trapped in the perspective of Fillory being a joke, without even considering the perspective of Fillory itself. It tried to do that once, when they showed a whole rebellion of Fillorians against the Earth rulers back in season 3. Again, this rebellion was honestly very warranted, and the Fillorians were very right for doing that. They rose up against people who do not even respect them, but the show still lands on the conclusion that the rebellion was indeed in fact wrong, because they attacked the main characters, but that they did have a bit of a point, just a little bit of a point. And then they still continuously crapped on Fillory all over, which again results in a conflict within the show itself. It tries to do this particular approach towards fantasy, but it also tries to assert some strong values that it doesn't inherently possess. Again, ironic that the writers speak of perspective through the show, yet fundamentally fail to consider others that happen to be anything outside of their own culture. When back in season 1, Quentin constructed an offensive image of Penny in his mind.
And today, we are to be serving chicken curry, which is of course my favorite.
You racist mother.
The show didn't find it funny, did it? This ultimately leads me to say that the show is simply virtue signaling when it is most convenient for them. Yet, there is still more area to cover. The 10th episode of the 4th season, I told you that season 4 is a gift that keeps on giving, gives us a little storyline about Margo. She ventures out into the desert to find a weapon capable of banishing the monster that has inhabited her dear friend Elliot. What she encounters is a village that is full of people that are being terrorized by supposedly evil spirits. What we end up finding out is that actually spirits are there to help the women instead of terrorizing everyone, and that they attack the source that may cause these women distress, which are mostly depicted in this episode to be be men. The message of this episode is very obviously laid out. Patriarchy is bad. I mean, as soon as Margo finds out who those spirits in the desert are, she goes out and directs the spirits to possess every man in the village who oppressed the women. My question here today is, how does this message hold up in the wider scale of the show? First, this comes as an interesting choice considering that Margo is consistently awful to another Fillorian woman, Fen. Second, this overall message rings a bit hollow when you consider what happens before and after the episode. We already discussed how the first season cast out Julia, yet decided to hand Quentin access to magic just like that, because for some reason Julia had to earn access to magic, while Quentin did not. But there are still two instances in particular where the show makes women act out of character for men. Season 4 decided to create two new couples. If you have watched the show, you can most likely guess what I am referring to. The first example comes from Margo and Josh. I want to bring your attention to yet another episode of the 4th season. The 12th episode of the season sees Josh become a fish due to a curse. Margo wants to lift the curse. Throughout the 4th season, Margo and Josh were shown to develop into a romantic couple. Now, I personally feel very indifferent towards this coupling. It doesn't really excite me. It is there. What I don't really enjoy here is that the relationship somewhat puts a stop to Margo's goal of helping Elliot. Apparently, because Josh is a special type of fish, he needs to be constantly watched in order not to die. We are also shown that she can remove her eye and just point it at Josh, and that does the trick. Mind you, this episode is the penultimate one. The pieces are falling into place, and we are nearing the conclusion of the season's arc. During this episode, Margo herself chooses to stay behind to save Josh. She says that,
I can't believe I'm saying this, but I can't go until he's cured. If I leave, Josh will die.
which was already established as preventable, since again, she can just point her eye right at Josh. Now, I don't think this exactly lines up with the character of Margo. Has she grown close to Josh? Yes. But she has been on this quest for this entire season, trying to save a person she has known for years and has been so close with. In that regard, her solo episode in the desert is so beautiful because the friendship and the bond that Elliot and Margo share is that strong. This particular scene underscores that very beautifully.
But I miss you so much. And I promise you, I'm gonna get you back.
So honestly, I just purely dislike it that she suddenly devotes herself to Josh at such a pivotal moment in their mission to save Elliot. Suddenly she throws the entire mission away at the last moments for a romantic male interest. If anything, I purely expected her to be heading in first with her access to hunt the monster herself. That would have been in character. This specific example is not as harmful. You can make the mental leaps and end up making sense of it. But for one last foray, let us return to the finale of Season 4. This episode concluded two major threads from Season 1. First, it is the journey of Quentin Coldwater. And second, it is the whole chain reaction that was caused by Jane Chatwin. You see, Julia went through a really tumultuous journey. First, she had to deal with Reynard. Then she was on her way to become a goddess and did become a deity. Then she had to sacrifice her power she built to fix Alice's mistake and bring back magic. Then she was in this weird in-between state of being a goddess and not at the same time. Season 4 provided us with a very definitive conclusion to this particular thread. Julia returns back to square one. She becomes a regular magician. This conclusion comes in a highly problematic way. You see, Julia is presented with a choice, either to become a goddess or to become a human again. Except when the time comes, she is incapacitated and cannot make the choice for herself. This choice and the control over Julia is handed over to her boyfriend, Penny. It is important to note that this Penny is a Penny from the 23rd timeline, and not the one the show has primarily taken place in. Right off the bat, I will say that I absolutely hate this pairing. I hate that they paired up Penny and Julia, not inherently because they are unfit. I just despise how they connected the two of them. Their whole relationship from the get-go was based off of Penny confusing this Julia for a Julia from his timeline. Obviously, there are two different Julias, but up to a point. You see, what always unsettled me is that, as far as timelines go, there's only one point of diversion. Up until a certain point, all Julias are the same. Therefore, their backgrounds are the same, and their characters characters are probably similar. The way that Penny describes his Julia as his soulmate implies that Penny probably got to know his Julia very closely. He already knows a lot of information about Julia. This carries a lot of implications. He already had a grip over what Julia is. Even if this Julia is different, she cannot be completely different. He also already has an image of her in his head to which he is attached to. Julia, on the other hand, doesn't really know Penny. This also carries an implication. This sort of discrepancy results in a few things. One, Penny somewhat has an advantage in this situation over Julia, because he knows at least something about her. Two, this would result in a rather weird dynamic considering that Penny already has an image of Julia in his head. Of course, you could say that they already established that this Julia is not his, but human psychology doesn't work that way. I very highly doubt that those few words were enough for Penny to simply erase everything he knew about the previous Julia, and not at least project some of it onto this one. Whichever way you spin it, this places Julia at a bit of a back foot in this relationship. She gets to know an entirely new person, while Penny already has something, which is why I think when faced with a choice whether to make Julia a goddess or a human, he acted exactly the way he did. This is implied through what Julia says in the aftermath.
I just know that this is not how it was supposed to be.
And that makes sense. What if he indeed allowed his previous perception of his Julia influence this decision? What if there exists this discrepancy and is therefore reflected in this choice? Too bad that all of this what I just told you was simply my headcanon. The show never really examines their relationship from this perspective. Imagine if it did. This would add an entirely new layer of drama to the whole ordeal. The way in which the show ultimately warps the character of Julia to serve as the character of Penny is through her reaction to Penny's choice. You have to remember that her whole arc from the beginning was about her trying to reach magic. It is what resulted in this rather traumatic journey in the first place. This has always been an integral part of her character. She wanted to do something more, something big with the magic that she had. She had this tenacity in her, which is why the choice that Penny makes fundamentally goes against everything that her character stands for. But still, it is her choice, and she should have chosen for herself regardless of whatever we have seen. Maybe she would have a change of heart at the last second. Who knows? Well, we don't know because the show takes this away from her. This in turn makes the reaction she displays towards Penny completely nonsensical. Once she wakes up and realizes she has become a human who also has no magic, we see Penny approach her. At first, she is mad, and she shows this, but then she also adds,
"You just stay here and let me be pissed at you."
I understand that her saying this is supposed to imply that she has some deeper feelings for him. Again, there is a place for irrationality always. But honestly, this is completely out of character for Julia. First, this person didn't even really attempt to ask her what she wanted to choose, which in itself is fundamentally violating. Second, even when he does choose something, it doesn't even fit her journey so far. She sought out magic so hard, and this person from another timeline took that away from her. I honestly think that they should have broken up right then and there. This is such a fundamental difference between their understanding of each other that is not even really looked at by the show. Imagine if they decided to bring up the fact that Penny knew a different Julia and therefore projected some of it over this one. He chooses that option because he thinks he knows what is the best. But does he really? The way the show frames everything isn't helpful either. This choice isn't ultimately made out as being one that should not have been made by Penny. It is rather framed as one that is apparently for the benefit of Julia, because Penny over here states that actually, he doesn't regret this at all.
Okay, truth, I was selfish. You were in pain, and it was never gonna stop, and I couldn't. And you know what? I would do it again, to not lose you again.
I mean, good for you that you don't have any regrets, I guess. It doesn't even matter that he admits to being selfish. Yes, he is right that what he did is very selfish, but knowing that he is selfish doesn't absolve him at all. It is very infuriating that they allow Penny to have a final say in this matter at all. And apparently because he was motivated to do this due to some supposed love for her, this makes it any better? I truly think that Julia should have stood up for herself and kicked this person out of her life. This choice alone is so violating on so many levels, and combined with the whole dynamic of their relationship, should have destroyed whatever they had. The only benefit of the doubt you can give him is that Julia was unconscious and therefore unable to choose for herself. But this guy is psychic. Just incept her mind and ask her? The original Penny was able to do that multiple times back in season 1 and probably in other seasons as well, yet this one suddenly does not? Instead, the show, while trying to be feminist, makes Julia throw away her whole character motivation because a man told her that he loved her, so she just stays with him. A female character who also chose incorrectly for other people, Alice, got at the very least half a season's worth of resentment from other characters, including her love interest Quentin, and she got put through the ringer way more than Penny, yet the show allows everyone to stay mad at her. But God forbid Julia stays rightfully mad at Penny. Not to mention the fact that Julia went through a great deal of trauma. Her journey has already been insanely scarring, and then the show decides to show her love interest undermine her in a traumatic way, once again a man taking away her agency. And all of this is how a whole serpentine maze of messages and contradictions is formed. The Magicians is a web of ideas that can at times come in contradiction to one another. The show wants to assert a serious view on mental health, yet have characters that are ridiculed for their struggles, which happens because they are attempting to be deconstructing the tropes of fantasy. The show wants to assert a viewpoint that is at least cognizant of feminism, yet has female characters that act in ways which are contradictory to that position, or have entire storylines that were born out of contradictions to this viewpoint. It tries to be bold in its viewpoints, and it tries to be bold in its approach to fantasy, and it also tries to be bold in its approach towards characters. But the way the show synthesizes these ideas, they are simply not compatible. I believe that there is a danger in the way The Magicians tackles and presents these topics. There might be a portion of you who will say that The Magicians never took itself too seriously, which is true. As a show, it really is campy. It has wacky ideas and executes them in even wackier ways. It certainly knows how to have fun. You can say that characters act in distasteful ways because it is realistic. This also can be true. There is always a place for that. But none of it excuses The Magicians, or any other show really, for presenting topics in a careless manner. It does not matter how campy or unserious you perceive the show to be. The perspective that I put forth is not me projecting something onto The Magicians that they do not want to have projected. This is something that the show itself voices. Fantasy can be a mirror to us, to our society and our reality. It can be a good medium for commentary, for sending a message. But in order to send that message, you must make sure that you communicated it correctly. You can say that the show is merely just entertainment. That is true, but there are real people watching, people who take away certain messages from the show itself. It may or may not have that type of influence. I must admit that this overarching interpretation of the show is not the most charitable one available. There are other ways to look at these choices. Julia becomes a human, not because of some overarching misogynistic intention, but rather because the narrative couldn't continue otherwise. Fenn is made fun of not because of the show's hidden intention to ridicule mental health issues or to be xenophobic. It is there simply because the writers may believe that this is the way to add some levity into the show. I can assert these more charitable views because I used to be a huge fan of the show. I rewatched it way more times than I could possibly count. I followed the discourse in the fandom all the way through, saw the interviews and the way the creatives behind the show presented their choices. But if those intentions were true, they suggest exactly the element that separates the concepts of being bold and being reckless. That is the lack of forethought for the full picture, the lack of understanding of consequences and the implications. The Magicians indeed attempts to challenge the fantasy tropes. It is a synthesis of many interesting ideas, and it undeniably offers us an interesting and unseen approach to magic. But allow me to ask you this: is it ultimately bold, or is it simply reckless? Kas yra fantastika? Ar langas, ar veidrodis? Dvi priešingos perspektyvos, egzistuojančios kartu.